Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Welcome sa ating po namang Wednesday Roundtable at Lido. Magandang umaga. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Mainit ang paksang pag-uusapan ngayon. May kinalaman po ito sa naging desisyon ng isang pandaigdigang lupon kahapon ng ikalima ng hapon at napag-usapan ang issue tungkol sa South China Sea. Sky, magandang umaga sa iyo.
Good morning po sa inyong lahat. Kahapon ay very historical sa ating bansa. No? So may mga nangyaring hindi natin alam kung matutuwa tayo o magiging victorious tayo for today. So magandang umaga din sa ating mga guests. Ngayong umaga dito sa Roundtable at Lido.
We will begin. We'll introduce our guests this morning. Kasama po natin si Senator Letty R. Shahani. Siya po ay dating chairman ng Senate Foreign Relations Committee ng Senado. Isa po sa pinakadalubhasa sa larangan ng ugnayang panlabas. We're joined by Professor Aileen Baviera. Siya po ay isang dalubhasa sa Contemporary China Studies at siya po ay nasa Asian Center ng University of the Philippines. We have with us Professor Batongbacal. Siya po ay nasa UP College of Law. Ang kanyang pagkadalubhasa ay sa Maritime Affairs at Law of the Sea. We're expecting Richard Heydarian, who will be here in a couple of minutes, and Chito Santa Romana, the former Bureau Chief of ABC in Beijing. So let's start. Magandang pag-usapan ito. Alam kong wala pang tulog ang ating kasamang si Jay. Pero sa objective na pananaw, Jay, ano ang nakita mo sa desisyon bago tayo magtanong sa iba pa natin mga kasama? Let's start, Jay.
Objectively, it's near complete victory nga, no? For the benefit of our yung audience, no, we have distributed yung parang score sheet on each one of the specific claims of the Philippines. No? As you know, there are 15 submissions, but many of the submissions can be divided further into minor submissions. No? And we basically ticked off alin yung granted and denied. Mapansin nyo, konti lang yung denied. And in a way, minor siguro yung dalawa. No? Siguro ang pinaka-serious na yung ating claims tungkol sa Ayungin Shoal. But nonetheless, overall, yung impact talaga ng decision is definitely in our favor.
If it is in our favor, what happens next?
Siyempre, dahil nga this is a judgment of international tribunal and it pertains to yung legal status ng claims sa South China Sea, particularly yung claim ng China, legal status ng mga features, at saka yung legitimacy ng activities. No?
Yeah, with your indulgence, Jay, we'd like to acknowledge our friends from the Malaysian, Japanese, and Vietnamese embassies. So we may have to talk in English.
Yes. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Since this decision, no, deals with the legal aspects of the South China Sea, legal status of China's claims, for example, the legal status of the features, islands and rocks and reefs, and the legitimacy of China's activities in the South China Sea, particularly the ones that are directed against Philippine ships and its activities that cause harm to the marine environment. No? Definitely, this favorable judgment places the Philippines firmly in the moral high ground when it comes to what should be done, what the parties are obliged to do in the South China Sea. And properly used, this can be turned into a great political leverage in any future dealings with China, whether it's on a bilateral or multilateral setting.
I think we should have a Philippine ambassador in Beijing who speaks perfect Chinese, who understands the Chinese language, because we could be solved by all of these translators. And the Chinese language is difficult to master. I mean, I think there are very few who speak Chinese among us. And that, I think, major qualification for those of us who would like to see the Philippines take a strong position. Now, I emphasize on the style of Philippine diplomacy because I don't think we should appear cowardly before the Chinese. You see, we are so used to being humble and kawawa, iyakin, you know. Now we have now this it's a moral victory and we have won all of the points. I'm not saying, and I agree with Secretary Yasai that we should make this with restraint and sobriety. So it should be a dignified position, but a position which is strong. And this is why I'm advocating an independent foreign policy. An independent foreign policy is easily misunderstood. I'm not anti-American or anti-Chinese, but I'm pro-Filipino. And even in this dispute, we should look at our national interest and at the same time look at our regional allies and see how we can strengthen our national interests. So this is, I think, my point. And I was present in the United Nations when we lost the Sabah claim. I know that our Malaysian colleagues are here. But we protested at the UN when the referendum was already over. So we should time our actions. We should study ahead of developments. And of course, it was too late. The referendum had been taken. The Sabaans had already said they wanted to be part of the Federation of Malaysia. But I must say, I admired the style of Ambassador Leone Guerrero, who had this pseudo Ateneo accent, who was also British, you see. And he spoke with conviction. And that is what we are looking for. See, people who will speak for the national interest and not be cowed down by either our allies, the Americans or the Japanese. See, although we are glad that we have these allies with us, but we should speak firmly now that we have this arbitration decision and we have won all of the points that you have raised. I think that this is a moral victory which we should take advantage of and not waste. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Baviera, you're into contemporary Chinese studies. How do you look at the Chinese psyche with this kind of decision from the tribunal?
Well, this decision is going to pose all sorts of dilemmas for China. Domestically, the Chinese narrative is that this whole South China Sea within the Nine-Dash Line belongs to them. They have historic rights. So apart from their being part of UNCLOS, they have been insisting that their history forms a big part of their claims in the area. And that is difficult to remove from the Chinese consciousness because it has been written into their history books, their maps, into the propaganda of the government. So that will be one hurdle for the Chinese. In their international relations, certainly, the Chinese version of this dispute and the arbitration itself includes, of course, the idea that the U.S. has been instigating the Philippines all along, that the arbitral tribunal has no jurisdiction, it is not an impartial body, and that China is somehow, exceptional in this case. It's not covered by the ruling itself. It's null and void. Is what they said. So that mentality, you're asking about the psyche of the Chinese,
Yes.
also is going to be very difficult for everyone else to accept. China can insist on it and stand on that leg for as long as it wants to, but I doubt that the rest of the international community will agree with China. So you raise the right question. Psyche is really a main consideration, a main problem that China will have to hurdle.
I see. But the delivery of Secretary Yasai's remarks yesterday had various reactions from netizens. If you watched it on television, how would you assess the way he delivered the message? Because some people say in the social media, say that he appeared to be a lawyer of the Chinese because he was not so.
He was very sad.
He was a bit sad, quote unquote.
Well, that is not at all how I perceived it. Yeah, it was a prepared statement, very carefully worded. I think the call for restraint and sobriety takes into consideration of course, it's a victory for the Philippines, a legal victory. It's not the end of the problem. It's probably the beginning of a long process of sorting out the details here. The legal victory will give us grounds and guideposts to proceed with our diplomacy and even our national policies. But the statement of Secretary Rasay, I guess, was addressing different audiences, including the international community. I thought I would read in it a concern that China would overreact, especially through military means, no? And that this harsh reaction would lead to also other parties getting involved in the issue. So I would say that the call for self-restraint was in part addressed at that. The call for sobriety was for the public, I thought, no? To be less emotional in its response on all areas, I guess, not just the Filipino public, but the Chinese public and other countries, other stakeholders on this issue. And he could have been more celebratory, but I think we anticipated it. I mean, long before the Duterte government had said that there would be no gloating, they're not going to taunt or flaunt any legal victory. So I thought it was expected.
No, thank you very much. We'd like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Richard Heydarian. Mukhang kasama rin doon sa Walang Tulog Gang. No? You've been around. You've been interviewed by various local and international television stations. How do you look at the decision, Professor Heydarian?
Yes, okay. I hope I'm still making sense. So, yes, sir, from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. I had interviews. So, okay, let me see. I have energy. I'm yet to go through the award, boy. I'm not sure if Jay was able to do it, but
He did.
I mean, it's 400 pages, right? Yeah. But yeah, exactly, almost 500 pages. But so far, based on what I've read and a quick view, it seems that for me it's almost a clean sweep. I think 14 out of 15 items. In fact, some would say 14.25 out of 15 items we have won, because even that one item that we had one problem, it's not a clearly unfavorable one for us. So for me, it's almost a clean sweep. That's how I'm gonna put it. And it's way beyond, I think, majority of experts would have expected. The clincher for me was the historical claim as a basis for the 9-dash line. I felt that that is inherently a sovereignty-related issue that supersedes or exceeds the mandate of the UNCLOS. I know I'm sounding like the Chinese side, but to be honest, this is something that a lot of Western international legal experts also have been telling me for the last 2 years. And yet the tribunal has exercised not only jurisdiction on that, but we got a favorable outcome. So this is the best case scenario we got, at least in de jure legal terms. But the question is, I'm sure Aileen, Jay, and the rest have talked about it, is what do we do with this verdict? To be honest, I think campaign trail palang, it was clear that the strategy of the Duterte administration was, okay, we have the same objective as the Aquino administration, which is the protection of our claims and sovereign rights. But the question is, what tactics do we use to achieve that? Will the tactic of confrontation and counterbalancing by siding with the United States against China work? Or maybe it's time for a new tactic? The fact of the matter is that when Aquino administration adopted a confrontational approach, no matter how legitimate it was, facts on the ground suggest that we did not create the necessary result that we were looking for. China's reclamation activities expanded by 1,000 acres, 3,000 acres, 1,000 hectares. China has expanded its footprint all across the South China Sea. And up until today, we need a clarification of how far the United States will go in assisting the Philippines. When I was in Shangri-La Dialogue the other month, I asked Pacific Command Admiral Harris if the United States will be clear about the extent of the mutual defense treaty in light of the fact that there are suggestions that China may build military facilities in Scarborough Shoal, which is 112 nautical miles away from Manila and 600 nautical miles away from Hainan. And the answer I got was the same kind of semantics and equivocations we have been getting for the last 6 years. So in light of the equivocations and lack of clear commitment on the part of the United States, and in light of China's encroachment into our waters and all across the South China Sea, I think it's time for a tactical change, at least temporarily, experimentally. But nonetheless, I think this is a vindication for Aquino administration that the legal warfare has worked. But the question is, how do you translate de jure success into de facto success? So now that Duterte is going to engage in bilateral talks with China, it has kind of already been happening. For the last 3 months, Duterte met the Chinese ambassador 3 times. He has met the Chinese ambassador, I think, more than any other ambassador. And the Chinese ambassador was the second ambassador he met after the Japanese ambassador. So I think a lot of discussions have been there. I've heard that 6 members of the cabinet have already visited Beijing. So I'm sure that China has put everything on the table. All sorts of infrastructure investments and all sorts of threats if the Philippines pushes ahead with releasing a strong statement. So the question we have in the coming days is, what will the statement, if ever, that will be released by the Duterte administration? Will it be a strongly worded statement that calls for compliance from China and tries to brand China as an outlaw unless it complies with it? Or will it be a much more generic statement that reflects our commitment to international law but calls for subdued bilateral negotiation? And to be honest, I think it's going to be the latter because the priority of Duterte administration is quote-unquote soft landing. And if that's your priority, you're not going to use this verdict to flaunt and taunt China. You're going to use this verdict to extract concessions once the backdoor channel negotiation will start in earnest in coming days.
All right. So that's it. Manang Letty, you mentioned that somebody who speaks the language is of importance. So this must be a political appointee and not a career diplomat. What is wrong with having a career diplomat?
Well, this is a test for our diplomatic career people, because it is so important now for us to get to our ASEAN counterparts, our friends in ASEAN, and those who have similar disputes with China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia. And I'm glad the Indonesian delegate is here, because in the law of the sea, Indonesia was our best friend. And we should remember those. We were the 2 countries who fought for the archipelagic doctrine. Arturo Tolentino, our brilliant senator, and he should really be remembered now. He fought for the archipelagic doctrine, which means that this 200-mile exclusive economic zone is ours, you see. And that was a big fight. And I think we should go back to some of our history, which we have forgotten. And I believe our diplomacy now should go back to ASEAN. I really don't understand why there is no consensus in ASEAN on this major issue. You see, because Cambodia, just because they have received economic aid, and Laos, etc., the consensus which formed ASEAN in the beginning, we're only 5 members of ASEAN. And this consensus is really something which cannot be achieved. So maybe we should rethink ASEAN now in this maritime dispute. But it takes a lot of diplomatic skill, is what I'm saying, you see, to back channel. And our diplomats must learn how to back channel to the Indonesians, the Malaysians, the Vietnamese, without the Chinese finding out what is really happening.
Okay. So we don't need a Trillanes here.
Well, masyadong mangaungaw sila sa Senate, if I may say so. You know, you cannot keep secrets. If you are back channeling, you better learn how to back channel, because that is an art in itself. And to learn how to keep your mouth shut. not to talk too much as they do in the Senate. Everyone wants to make a privileged speech. I'm sure there'll be many privileged speeches on all
Today.
this arbitration. Well, I don't
Well,
know.
come,
Opening of the
opening of the
Senate on
session.
the 25th of July.
Yeah. Professor Jay, looking at the history of the PCA, has there been any decision before similar to the Philippines na parang panalo lahat eh? What I was expecting is we will win some, we will lose some, pero dito mukhang panalo lahat. No? We got what we wanted.
In terms of a case where another party refused to participate and the participating party still got what it prayed for, we have the example of the Netherlands and Russia over the Arctic sunrise. This was actually a case that caused a bit of concern because it was filed after we had filed the case against China. And Russia took a very similar position vis-a-vis the arbitral panel, that saying that it did not recognize the jurisdiction of the panel. But nonetheless, it was resolved in favor of the Netherlands. In terms of getting most of what was prayed for, there are sort of similar cases, no, but none of this magnitude. The sheer number of claims, for example, that the Philippines presented. Usually the cases, they have very small numbers of claims, maybe 4 or 5 is already a lot. This time we have 15 submissions that, as you see from our scorecard, can actually amount to about 30 plus specific issues. So this is really unprecedented, both in terms of what has happened, meaning you have a strong, a major power being a party that actively refused and even tried to undermine the jurisdiction of the tribunal. And the claims, the nature of the claims is also unprecedented. The technique or the roadmap, the procedural roadmap that we took, which is to limit the case to only the maritime rights and entitlements and leave sovereignty issues untouched. No? The only similar case to that is the Chagos Archipelago case, which was decided only a year ago. So this is really a kind of a breakthrough, no? And it really is a very important case for various reasons. Among them, the fact that it has established precedents, precedents not in the legal sense, but in the sense that the tribunal in this case really decided issues in an unexpected way and also decided important issues that previously other tribunals shied away from. No? Particularly yung issue ng entitlements, interpretation of Article 121 of UNCLOS, no? And whether you can separate maritime entitlements from sovereignty issues.
Okay. The basic question is, people think that this case, the award, will decide on the territorial sovereignty issue of the islands and reefs. Tama po ba ito? Is this right?
Well, actually, that's one of the misconceptions that unfortunately probably still continues. No, the Philippines, in order to be able to pursue this case, had to expressly exclude the question of territorial sovereignty, and therefore the case does not touch on who owns any of these islands or features. And by implication, it also does not touch on who owns the territorial seas around these features, which is 12 nautical miles from shore. And each one of those islands, basically, with 12 nautical mile territorial seas, that's practically the size of Pampanga in area niya. So you have many of these features, Pampanga-sized features, whose sovereignty is still undecided, and which has basically been declared to be disputed areas. That is where actually the disputes, around that aspect, the disputes will now continue because these are huge areas. And also, if I may note, with respect to the 9-dash line and China's historic rights, there's also an emerging misunderstanding, I think, of exactly what the tribunal said with respect to China's historic rights. It's not the case that China has no historic rights at all in the South China Sea. it's a case where the tribunal said that whatever historic rights China may have, it is only limited to the land features and at most the 12 nautical mile territorial seas around them. So meron pa rin natira, which the tribunal has expressly also said that does not have it does not exercise jurisdiction over because it's a sovereignty issue now. No? So meron pa rin siyang konting historic rights, but definitely na-reduce siya greatly. It has been greatly reduced, and whatever historic rights China may have and might have any kind of evidence it definitely will not extend to the full area of the 9-dash line. No? It can at best be limited to only the islands and the waters around them, up to 12 nautical miles.
Really? So in that case, there are people who think that the Philippines' maritime entitlements, including the fishing rights, exploitation rights, etc., in the disputed areas will be clarified with the decision through the arbitration.
Well, some of them definitely, especially those entitlements to the resources in the waters beyond 12 nautical miles from any land feature. What the tribunal has basically ruled is that outside 12 nautical miles from any feature, these are all either Philippine exclusive economic zone or continental shelf or the high seas. No? And that is the most important, especially with respect to Reed Bank, which is the area over which the Philippines has the greatest interest because of its potential petroleum resources. And then it also has implications to the fishing, especially in the areas between the Kalayaan Island Group and Palawan. Those areas are definitely Philippine fishing grounds under this decision. And it also has, finally, implications on the legitimacy, the legality of China's structures in the so-called low tide elevations which generate no maritime zones, particularly Mischief Reef, Ayungin Shoal. No? Clearly, the tribunal has described these places as being part of Philippine continental shelf or exclusive economic zone. So it should be the Philippines which has a superior right to these places.
Okay. Sky, mukhang nagulat ka.
The decision yesterday was very historical for us. I would just like to ask also, kasi sa social media, there are a lot of Filipinos who are in China. Medyo natakot ka agad with the decision. What do you think can happen to them, or how do you think should they do right now?
Yes, si Aileen.
Yes. Well, I think the Philippine embassy was correct to put out or to caution the Filipinos in China to stay away from political discussions, don't talk about the arbitration, and so on, because this could be an emotional time for the Chinese themselves. But I think for ordinary Chinese, Chinese government and their media outlets will try to manage the situation. They will allow only certain spin, maybe certain angles of the ruling to filter to the Chinese public. They will have their other sources, and the people will have their other sources, but the government will try to manage it so that it is more harmonized with whatever the government policy will be. So if the government chooses not to allow this to escalate tensions or to provoke certainly military actions, then they will try to tamp down. Nonetheless, social media will be expected to play an important role.
Yeah, I saw pictures that our embassy was cordoned by the police for the Filipino security. Madam Letty, what do you have to say about what's happening now? What will happen to Filipinos in China?
Well, I think the Malacanang has now to put out an explanation of how we should react to this historic situation, as you say. But I read in the Inquirer today that it will take 5 days for the Solicitor General to come out with an opinion. I think he should do it faster. 5 days is too long. Now, I know it's a very complicated issue, but there has to be a strong statement on what this means. And I think the average Filipino, I'm from Pangasinan, and I know Masinloc, we call it Scarborough Shoal. But as children who live in the Lingayen Gold, this is Masinloc for us. It's a mining town. And for the Chinese to water cannon those fishermen who have traditionally fished for centuries in those areas, and our own Philippine Army could not even water cannon back. You see, I mean, these are some of the weaknesses of our position. In other words, and this is what I've said quite often, and I know Aileen and Jay know my position, the foreign policy has now become domestic policy for us in the Lingayen Gulf. And this is why I think foreign affairs has to give local government some role in guarding our coastlines. Now, this is of course something, and I spoke to the former governor of Pangasinan, Governor Espino, and he said, pero national yan foreign policy eh. Foreign policy is national, we have nothing to do, but how shall we guard this long coastline of the West Philippine Sea, which extends from Batanes to Palawan? You need local government help. These are some of the rethinking we have to do. There is no more foreign policy in this response. Foreign policy has become domestic. Now, how do we react to that, you see? And this is important, and I think our friends in the region should understand that we have a responsibility to defend our own coastline.
Very well. Richard?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as Aileen pointed out, this is a very sensitive issue. Actually, the Hague verdict was the leading hashtag in Weibo, which is the Twitter of China, yesterday. So this was a national conversation among 1.3 billion people. So you have to be very careful when you deal with that. And yesterday, last night, I've been on back-to-back interviews with international channels, and I was debating with some of the Chinese quote-unquote scholars. And the kind of language that they developed, was extremely jittery and aggressive, to a point that I almost had a meltdown and had to clarify. I am an independent scholar, not speaking for my government here, to that point. So when you see their academics speaking in that language, that gives you a sense of the political climate there in China. So I think in some way, I know that Yasai's statements was quote-unquote bitin, too subdued for such a historic event. But I think when you take into consideration the political climate in China and how things could get worse, I see the wisdom in retrospect, right? Okay, now, moving forward, the point is this. Ironically, this verdict could serve as a springboard for us to freeze the situation because both sides have something on each other. On the part of the Philippines, clear, it's a binding decision per Article 296 of the Convention and Article 211 of Annex 7. Yes, but enforcement is the next big question. How do we actually enforce it? Now, there are three things that are going for us on that issue. The first thing is the United States, Japan, and other major powers could use particular provisions of the verdict, particularly on the nature of the disputed features, to justify more aggressive freedom of navigation operations. The FONOPs are used to counter so-called excessive maritime entitlement claims, because China claims that some of these land features in the Spratlys are islands that can generate their own 200 nautical miles EEZ, while our argument is that some of them are low-tide elevations that cannot be occupied and generate any territorial water. So the United States will use this as a legal pretext to step in. This is important because the US has been conducting several rounds of FONOPs, but they don't have a clear legal justification for that. In fact, sometimes they use the term right of innocent passage, which was a big mistake. So now other countries, not only US, but even the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces, under the collective security doctrine, could also join these FONOP operations to enforce this. So the enforcement will fall upon these great powers. The second issue is this. I've been talking about this. I know Jay's aware of this. We've been dealing with the Vietnamese and some other ASEAN countries a lot, and they've been preparing their own case versus China. Now I think they're in a stronger position to threaten China in a very credible way, if not completely file similar cases. Our Vietnam case is more complicated because they have both paracels and Spratlys. But nonetheless, I think this exceeded expectations of everyone because the last time I was in Hanoi, they didn't even think, from what I gathered, that we could even overcome the procedural admissibility or jurisdiction ground. We overcame not only jurisdiction, but we also got the positive verdict. So now China, in layman terms, is vulnerable to what you can call a class suit because the Indonesians have informally threatened that, the Vietnamese have threatened that. So China is not facing possibly one country, but multiple countries. I've even heard that the ruling party of Japan has decided that even over the Senkaku DLU, they may also resort to international arbitration. The third issue is this, which goes to the heart of the issue. Yes, China is the biggest military power in the region, no question about it. But China is not North Korea, it's not a rogue state. It wants to be respected as a leader. But how can you be respected as a leader if you're seen as an international outlaw? So the very authority and legitimacy behind China's claim to leadership in Asia is now at stake. And you cannot pick and choose international law. You cannot say, I will not accept arbitration when I lose. And then later on, you need that arbitration proceedings. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese are the global maritime power. They need UNCLOS on their side to make sure that sea lines of communication around the world are protected. So they cannot pick and choose UNCLOS now and reject this issue. That is why the Chinese are in a panic mode right now, and they're in damage control mode. The least they want to do is that Duterte will not release a strong statement. And this has implication for ASEAN. Let's be very brutally honest. I write for Straits Times in Singapore. I'm going to write later on calling for ASEAN unity. But I'm very brutally honest. Cambodia's Hun Sen, Prime Minister, came openly out and said the arbitration proceeding is a political conspiracy. Whether he believes it or it's because he's in the pocket of China, I don't care. The fact of the matter is that we're not going to get consensus because ASEAN is institutionally paralyzed to make decisions on very high security issues like this. If we had a qualified majority voting mechanisms like EU, we would get a statement, but we have a unanimity based. So what I'm at least expecting is certain influential countries in ASEAN, like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam, I'm not sure about Thailand, will at least release certain element of support on an individual basis. We already saw that during the Kunming meeting, whereby the ASEAN foreign ministers and China met. The ASEAN could not release a joint statement because some of the countries were not comfortable with that joint statement, so Malaysia leaked that joint statement to put pressure on some of the other countries. And then individually, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia released statements essentially criticizing China's position and reaffirming the Sunnyland statement with the US. I see a similar situation panning out. The ASEAN will not side with China, but the ASEAN may not necessarily side with us as a whole, but certain key ASEAN countries can individually release strong statements. And for me, if we can get Cambodia to hell with it, at least it's important we get Indonesia and other important countries in the ASEAN. But the fact of the matter is this, to just wrap it up, China is a powerful country. They have already gathered 8 African plus Afghanistan to oppose this arbitration, and I'm sure in the coming days they will try to bribe as many countries around the world to oppose this arbitration case. We may have the West on our side, but we need to get more developing countries on our side, and that means we have to have very proactive foreign diplomacy. Otherwise, unfortunately, China may be in a position to denigrate and delegitimize this process by running different developing countries behind it. So we have high-stake diplomacy ahead of us. My best wishes for Yasai.
Really? Do you think it's doable in the terms of President Ramos at the time? Doable po ba ito? Yung sinasabi ni Professor Heydarian?
Well, I don't consult President Ramos.
Pero
Otherwise,
yung sinabi niya, doable.
I'm for an independent foreign policy, and I've never asked him whether he agrees with me or not. Anyway, because we don't want to form a dynasty, you see, that I'm sort of telling you that is our family formula.
It's your legacy.
And well, I don't know what is a legacy. It's not so easy, you know, when Melo, for instance, asked me questions like that. But I think I agree with Professor Heydarian that we really need to find our allies in this fight because we cannot do it alone. And we have many friends, you see. I would, of course, our ASEAN friends are here, our Asian friends are here. I've said Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, Japan. And I'm sure those who don't want to go to war in China. And I won't worry about social media. You know, I mean, our diplomatic corps is becoming a kind of a social welfare department. And that is what we're always these overseas workers, may namatayan. Where is our ambassador? He's there yung condoling with the grieving family when he should really be looking at trade statistics. Oh, that's my one. Or he's in a basketball much in New Jersey when he should really be going to Wall Street to talk to the major contributors to Hillary Clinton. You know what I mean, no? So let us get out of the Department of Foreign Affairs becoming a second Department of Social Welfare. Or the diplomats now, they should think about national interest, sovereignty, and independence. That is what our Constitution says, you see. And so social media, we have to educate our people. For that Philippine ambassador, you know, I was Philippine ambassador to Australia, and the first time the Belgian ambassador asked for an audience with me, he wanted to look for a Filipino maid. And I thought he would go on to ask me to how to improve trade between Belgium and the Philippines. All he wanted was to find a Filipino maid. And of course, I sort of dismissed him. I'm not an ambassador for that purpose, I told him. So these are some of the weaknesses of our diplomatic corps, and this is a time for us to shape up and maybe have a style that is more aggressive but friendly, and where we can convince the Chinese people who don't want war. Now, I also heard Larry Baha yesterday over DZMM. And he said something very important. We cannot go to the United Nations Security Council because there is no outbreak of hostilities yet. And let's not forget, China is a member of the permanent member of the Security Council. Of course, they will kill any attempt for us to bring that issue to the UN. You see, I mean, these are the things we should know. The UN is not a Supreme Court where all the rights of everybody will be recognized. It is really the most political body in the world to make sure that the stronger powers will be in control of this World Assembly. So these are the lessons we have to learn before we are able to meet the Chinese on this very big issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Baviera, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to pick up on some points mentioned by Richard with regard to our ASEAN diplomacy, but also to express very much my agreement with Senator Shahani's statements that this will be very challenging times for our Department of Foreign Affairs, for our diplomats, for our security planners, for our strategists, and government as a whole. Because there are this is going to be a long process, I think. There are certain skills, expertise that we need to develop, most of all probably in negotiations, both bilateral and multilateral. On the point of Richard on ASEAN, I think what this award gives us, well, it's not just the Philippines that's benefiting from it, but the region as a whole, because it gives us more clarity on what rules should apply in the disputed areas. So regardless of the sovereignty issues, which will remain, regardless of the disputes, there are now certain rules that are clear to us. We can treat this as our exclusive economic zone. We can explore and exploit the resources there, subject, of course, to the usual constraints under UNCLOS. Now, that should apply as well to the other countries who have EEZs in the South China Sea. So that can help us push forward, for instance, the Code of Conduct discussions between ASEAN and China. It can also provide, hopefully, some clarity with respect to, say, for instance, there's this code for unplanned encounters at sea that's being negotiated. Countries are considering, this is an agreement among navies. Countries are considering expanding this to include the law enforcement authorities, coast guards of the different countries in the region. So whatever we see now in the provisions, in the ruling, that may be applicable, at least to the EEZs. The EEZs, of course, are different from military activities and so on. But there are certain principles there of respect for the rights of coastal states and the rights of other user states that may now be, we can enliven, we can enrich the debates rather than proceeding with, negotiating codes of conduct, negotiating agreements without having any firm principles to hold on to, because we didn't know what the rules were. Now, the ruling doesn't address everything, but it's a beginning. As far as the Philippines is concerned, when we should start planning to develop our exclusive economic zone. We should start thinking about what to do, how to develop the fishing there, the oil exploration, and test the ruling to the extent that we are capable of. If we are not capable, we should develop the capabilities to enforce this ruling on our own, separate from the diplomacy.
Okay.
But the diplomacy is also very important.
You know, it's very timely. I just saw an article from the South China Morning Post just now. It says a provocative U.S. action could prompt faster Chinese military buildup. So some people think the decision yesterday was in favor of the United States. So do you think the United States will still make its presence felt because of its American pivot in Asia?
Well, we are talking up until November when the US will have elections, and we don't know what the foreign policy will be after that. No? So we don't know if the pivot will remain in place. Of course, there are countries that would most certainly want the US to remain engaged, not necessarily in a confrontational or provocative manner, but to play the role of a stabilizer. No? So that's a question. The US involvement, of course, the US has its own interests. And this is, I think, what the Philippines should also be conscious of. No? To the extent that our interests, defined as access to the resources, no? Certainly security against external threats, and peace and stability in the region. So to the extent that these interests converge with those of the US, then we are fine. I think we should be fine having them play a role. But where there are U.S. interests that go beyond our interests, then we should also take a careful look. For instance, just to be more explicit, we are after, say, access to the resources. And U.S. And China have their own game in place. It's power rivalry. It's about power projection and having a strong naval presence, and so on. So if the interests of the big powers will sideline the Philippine search or the Philippine objectives of equitable access to the resources, a peaceful and stable regional environment, then this is where we have to look to develop more complex approaches and strategies. And yeah.
Maganda ito. We will open the floor to our colleagues from the media. We have a microphone somewhere. Pakihanap na lang po. Ay, ito pala. Yes. Pakisuyo na lang po, pakipasa ng mikropono. Please identify yourself and the entity you come from. Yes, okay. We will have them later, no? Richard, they will be coming.
I know.
Good morning. I'm Joel Quinto from ABS-CBN News. To Professor Baviera, ma'am, you mentioned about how you view the Chinese psyche. What responses do you think are possible from China in view of this ruling? And also another question to Professor Batongbacal. Sir, the government has said that there would be negotiations based on this ruling on a possible joint use of the area. What types of joint exploration would be possible, and would this be would this not violate the constitution?
Responses from China, I think we need to anticipate a range. Also look at the short term, medium, and long term. And the I guess the level or dimension for China, the domestic, the regional, and the global. Because this issue has attained a significance, I think, far beyond what even the Philippines anticipated when we filed the case. I think short term, we can, as we are seeing now, harsh words, strong statements of opposition, resistance. And this will be replicated in the academic community, think tanks, government, social media. And this is a natural reaction. I think any country who suffers a defeat in international courts will have a similar reaction, but we will see it in bigger scale in China, I imagine. Medium term, China has to balance its interests. The disputes the maritime rights issues are they're not even number one in the in the hierarchy of China's foreign policy goals and interests. And I think over time, China will have to learn to accept that this is in the same way that their reclamation and island construction has created new facts on the ground. They will have to start to figure out how to accommodate a new status quo where there is this international law ruling, this case, and decisions that have been made that contest their claims. So how to make the adjustments will be another question that can come in the form of their regional diplomacy, their approach towards ASEAN and coastal states bordering the South China Sea. A very important part as far as China is concerned, again, is the strategic dimension, their relations with the United States. So if you look at it from China's perspective, they're a major power. They are number one economically now in the world. You have people who have very high aspirations, high expectations also of their own government, therefore putting a lot of pressure on their own government. So from this perspective, China will have to hurdle many challenges to come up with a proper approach. But again, there are other interests that China has to protect and promote. It has undertaken a lot of major foreign policy initiatives, One Belt, One Road, including Maritime Silk Road. We have the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. All of these are intended to play up China's capacity to be a regional leader. And these are intended to project China's image as a big power which will be a provider of public goods. And now that runs entirely contrary to a China that will flout international law, say that it will ignore the ruling and just do things the way that they have been doing all along. So those are certainly considerations in how China will shape their response from short term to long term.
Yes, Professor
So
J.
the second question, first of all, negotiations are inevitable, I think, because it is a peaceful mode of settlement of disputes. The only question is whether, when you go into a negotiation, you actually have a strategy and you actually have clear objectives. And that, I think, has always been the problem previously. It may be either bilateral or multilateral. It really depends on what particular problem you want to address. Now, the issue of negotiating joint development or joint management or sharing of resources, I think the tribunal has also opened the door for this in a way, because, for example, when it comes to Scarborough Shoal, the finding of the tribunal is that the fishery resources in Scarborough Shoal are actually shared between Filipinos, Chinese, Vietnamese, and other nationalities. And therefore, that in itself, under international law, opens the door for talks on how this sharing can take place in a way that does not cause additional problems or become a reason for tensions. With respect with respect to the areas around the islands, the 12 nautical mile zones around the islands, and the islands themselves, these are also impliedly declared and accepted also by the Philippines to be disputed areas because the sovereignty issues have not been addressed. They were excluded by the Philippines. And in so doing, in filing this case, the Philippines impliedly accepted as well that these are disputed areas, not exclusively Philippine areas. And that, therefore, will open doors for, again, a practical arrangement on how to share, for example, resources or activities in this area. It's going to be an interesting new legal question, whether the Constitution, for example, can be deemed to apply to this kind of admittedly disputed area. And I'm sure that it will be controversial on our part, but what is important for us, I think, is to make a decision on what we want to do, what do we want to achieve, and have a good strategy on achieving our objectives, and then conduct our relations, which include negotiations, in accordance with that long-term strategy.
Okay. One short question people would like you to answer would be, now that a decision has been made, can our fishermen go there and fish? Is it as easy as that? As what Noli de Castro asked former Ambassador Bach. Is it that easy? Can we go back to the fishing grounds and fish? Yes, Jay.
Well, of course, it's not that easy because you have the legal, the decision, which says that legally we are entitled to fish there, but you also have the reality that China and its forces are still there, and unless we come to some kind of arrangement, for example, that they should not harass the fishermen, then the possibility exists that they will still impede the movements of our fishermen. That's why it's important to continue the dialogue, to re-engage China in discussion, because these are practical matters. When these are addressed, let's say there are talks that engage, and then the fishermen are permitted, or the fishermen are able to fish without hindrance. No, that does not necessarily mean that we are changing the legal situation. That doesn't necessarily mean that we will be turning our back on the judgment. No? Because it is possible in international law to have what we call a no prejudice clause. No? And international law even promotes this idea of no prejudice, and promotes, encourages states to enter into what are called practical arrangements, provisional arrangements of the practical nature, which states can enter into without affecting their legal positions and the legal status of either the features, activities, or the contested areas.
Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, very quickly. I'm sorry. Well, first of all, I think when it comes to joint development, we have to be very clear about the parallels that we use. When we had the project in Malampay with the Shell company as a private company acknowledged that we have sovereignty over those waters. But having joint development with China is complicated because they claim inherent and indisputable sovereignty. And that could run counter to the provisions of our constitution. So let's be very clear, when we talk about joint development, consistently with our constitution is something that we have to keep in mind. The other thing is, if you're going to discuss joint development and how to delimit our overlapping claims down the road, we can do it bilaterally, but there's another option under UNCLOS, under Article 1, Annex 5, the Conciliation Commission, whereby the two countries could come together and form a mutually acceptable tribunal that will provide advisory opinion on how the two countries can use relevant provisions of the UNCLOS to actually settle the legal nitty-gritties of their disputes. This is something I've been talking about for the last 2 years with international law experts, because a lot of us felt that perhaps the Philippine case will not fly. This could be an alternative mechanism. But regardless, my point is that that mechanism could still work. And based on the interviews I've done with Chinese media, I've noticed that the Chinese scholars said theoretically that's possible with China, because it's not a third-party intervention on matters of sovereignty. It's some sort of a kind of a marriage counseling. So if, let's say, compulsory arbitration in layman terms is something like a divorce proceeding and fight over child custody, this is more an issue of how to bring the two disputing parties together. So I'd rather have us discuss the nitty-gritties of our overlapping claims under the aegis and supervision of the UNCLOS than to do it bilaterally with lack of transparency. We had a very bad experience with JMSU in 2005 to 2008. So I think that should serve as a warning that we have to be very careful with these joint development, joint exploration schemes. The last thing I would want to say, no, okay, sige, I'll stop it there because Senator wants to talk.
Yes, Senator Letty.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I wouldn't confine myself to just legal or technical negotiations because you have a long history with China. And for the Filipinos, siopaw is more acceptable than McDonald's sandwich, correct?
Yeah.
And bamundok is a byline in Philippine cuisine. I mean, we have this long interaction with China over the years, and we have all of these Taipans who have migrated to the Philippines, and this because of this country's hospitality, they have become big people, which they would not have been able to do in China. So we have many people who would like to leave us together in peace with China. So why don't we form groups like the Seas or I don't know, all of these Taipangs, you see, who have investments also in China and see how we can live in peace. I think this is it. Why don't we have a women to women who don't want war anyway? They don't want to have the kids killed or their husband killed in war. Or the military. I mean, there's enough now of, I've been reading about the Japanese occupation in this country. I mean, and also the Dallas shooting. There's too much violence now in the world, and we need to live in peace and prosperity. So I think a people-to-people effort, which DFA should encourage, and not just to limit yourself to arbitration tribunal. This is my main criticism of the DFA approach. They were just looking all the time at the tribunal, which is important, of course. But there is the people to people, the goodwill which we have for each other, the history, we have the shared history, you see, and the hospitality which you have shown to the Chinese people when they were down and out. I think this should not be forgotten. And we should make an appeal to the Chinese people to be rational and that we should live in peace, because going to war is something which we should not even think about.
Yes, Aileen.
Well, I think on approaching China post arbitration ruling, China has already said that it's not going to accept the ruling, and it is not bound by it. But that doesn't mean that that China doesn't want to fix the relations with the Philippines, or that China doesn't want to somehow move forward on the South China Sea issue. Again, as I said, because if there are greater interests involved. So what I foresee is that if we start dialogue with China, well, they want bilateral, of course. They've been waiting for this government to start off the bilateral talks. So having a third party involvement again may not be acceptable to them. And what might happen is the Philippines will be approaching it with the ruling as our starting point, which is not acceptable to China. Mm-hmm. So even on the initial terms of the dialogue or consultation, we're not talking about negotiating even, no? But just the consultation on what the impact of this ruling is. We may have to disagree. So it's not going to be very simple. And we may need to agree to disagree on certain points, but at least reiterate a commitment to peaceful settlement initially would be good, and take it from there. No? Sincerity will be very important. There's still a lot of mistrust, definitely, that will need to be overcome. So perhaps prior to, my thinking is perhaps prior to directly addressing the issues arising from the ruling, we do need sort of a cooling off period, stepping back, both sides, to try to jumpstart a political dialogue and assess the relationship as a whole.
Yes.
So because both sides have said this is not the end all be all of our relationship, there are other things going, and I very much appreciate Senator Shahani's input about people to people relations.
Yeah, Professor Aileen, I don't know whether it's inherent among the Chinese or among us Asians. They value face saving. How do you save one's face with all this that has happened? Is there a way out for China?
Yeah. Face saving is, you don't do it by yourself. It's a relational thing. If China needs to save face, the Philippines can help it save face. If the Philippines also needs to save face, definitely. I mean, this was why we filed the arbitration. Napahiya tayo eh. We lost face. And therefore, we felt that we needed to do something. So both sides, I think, need to find face-saving solutions. That's our principle. Meaning, we stick to our principles. Both sides will of course, want to promote their legitimate interests. But I think within that framework, it is possible to treat the relationship with greater sensitivity. It is a very delicate relationship at this time. And if both sides want to help each other save face, then then we just need to be creative in looking for solutions.
So we need to be arrogant and waive the decision, the 500 pages. No? Say, we won, we won.
Yes. We did win, we do want compliance, but we don't need to say it all the time.
Yeah, okay. More questions here, please.
Sir, Christian is here from ANC. I'm talking about face-saving solutions. What would be a practical face-saving approach at this point, especially in light of the refusal of China to allow our fishermen to refusal to give them access to Scarborough? For example, can they stay there, the vessels meaning, but quietly our fishermen can be allowed to fish? Would that be an arrangement that would be face-saving and acceptable at this point?
My understanding is in Scarborough, that is already the situation. Our fishermen have been allowed to return. They have not been apprehended in just the weeks in the run-up to Duterte taking office. So this was interpreted in the Philippines as already a gesture of goodwill towards the new government. In a way, there was strong support for the Aquino government filing the arbitration case, and congratulations certainly are due to the Aquino government. But in a way, it is fortuitous that we have a new government in place. No? So the burdens, no? The bad blood, so to speak, between the previous government and China is not there to poison the relationship. No? So in a way, there's an opportunity for new beginnings. China has to step back, definitely, from its assertiveness. No? And this is a new situation, a new government. If China wants to make things right, then it can have opportunities under the Duterte government, perhaps more than the previous government.
Okay, would you care to add? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think at the very minimum, the Chinese, of course, are in a damage control now. What they want is that we don't release a strongly worded statement. But the problem is that the Americans sent a special envoy, Christy Kenny, and among others, to precisely try to convince us to use this verdict.
What's she doing here anyway?
I'm sure she's on a mission here to convince Duterte to stick to the previous strategy, which is what we call constrainment strategy, where the US and its allies all together try to put maximum diplomatic pressure on China until it blinks. But clearly Duterte has a different tactic in mind. I think his tactic is direct engagement. Now, let me be very clear about this. I think people talk about multilateral and bilateral as if the two are mutually exclusive. You can do bilateral and multilateral at the same time. This is what we call bi-multilateralist approach. The Vietnamese have been dealing with the Chinese on a bilateral basis consistently over the years, and yet under the aegis of the ASEAN and other international bodies, they have also been putting pressure on China because only a fool
They get all the benefits, no?
they get all the
China and
benefits.
Americans, no?
That's what diplomatic dexterity is all about. I mean, you cannot just rely on multilateral or on bilateral.
Yeah.
On a purely bilateral basis, we'll be cornered by China, even if we have a bargaining chip. But on a purely multilateral basis, you're missing the point. You're still supposed to talk to China to resolve these disputes. Even the UNCLOS is clear that the parties themselves have to resolve this among themselves immediately, ultimately. But the point is the two are not mutually exclusive, they could be complementary. So during the Aquino administration, we saw too much multilateral, too little bilateral. I hope under the Duterte administration we'll not see the opposite. We need a Goldilocks combination of multilateral and bilateral so that we have the proper bargaining chips when we deal with China. Now, this is where the arbitration could help us because the Chinese want us to, at the very least, not release a strong statement. Maybe we can ask certain concessions to allow yung ating mga inista na magkaroon ng access dyan sa may West Philippine Sea. We can also ask the Chinese to give us guarantee na hindi sila mag-build ng military facilities dyan sa may Scarborough Shoal at hindi sila mag-impose ng exclusion zone or ADIZ dyan sa may Kalayaan. Kasi kung usapan lang ng kakayahan, meron ng kakayahan ng China na completely ipitin tayo dyan sa may Kalayaan at saka ipitin din yung ating mga may ngista dyan sa may West Philippine Sea in the Scarborough Shoal area. They have the de facto upper hand. We have the de jure upper hand. How do we reconcile this in order to get the best concessions out of China? This is what the diplomacy will be about in the coming days.
Manang Letty. Yes, please.
The suggestion was made over DZMM yesterday, and I think this group should react to that suggestion, that the first state visit of President Duterte should be China. Now, I think this is something which is worth discussing here, the pros and the antis, and before I say my opinion, I think that is
Yeah, okay.
the others.
So let's ask the
Jay first.
Or
Yeah.
to put it more bluntly, how do you deal with the likes of Lloyd and Nicolas?
Well, they're private citizens. No?
Okay.
I think in connection now with face saving as well, I think at this point what we need are gestures of goodwill. At this point, no? I mean, we've had this very, very tumultuous past few years, but this is a new administration, and that particular process has concluded, and we now therefore have a chance to reset relationships. No? We can still, of course, base all our future dealings on the basis of this decision. But that doesn't mean that we have to, as you say, kanina, no, wave and
We want.
that's also not advisable even in normal relations, person-to-person relations, di ba? The possibilities are already there. No? I mean, both sides have given each other certain signals that they're willing to at least talk with each other and give a chance to have better relations. No? I think it should start from there. I mean, we cannot expect these things to be resolved in a day or immediately. And there's certainly certain issues, certain aspects of dispute. The dispute will be very, very difficult to resolve. But at least we can, re-establish good relations. No? And the suggestion that the first state visit should be to China, I think that would be a very, very strong signal. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are surrendering or giving up anything. Well, properly handled, it could show that we are remaining firm and yet demonstrating, real statesmanship, by doing, by carrying out this kind of gesture despite what has happened.
Thank you. Yes, Professor.
Yeah, just online. It will give China face, and I think they might appreciate that.
Richard?
I've been making this suggestion, but more quietly for quite a while. Regardless for me who would have been the next president, even if it's Maro, us, or whatever, my point is China is our most important immediate neighbor. Yes, the United States has been our historical ally, but China is our most important neighbor. And as I always say, this cliche, keep your friends close, keep your rivals even closer. And this is, I think, the perfect opportunity for us to have an icebreaker, because for the last 4 years since Xi Jinping came into power, he has held formal dialogue with almost all leaders in the Asia-Pacific region last time I checked, with the exception of President Aquino. All they had was chit-chat. That doesn't count as a formal dialogue. A formal dialogue is when the two leaders talk, they have a joint statement, they reaffirm their bilateral relations. Shinzo Abe of Japan had that bilateral meeting with China in China during the APEC summit. All important leaders of Vietnam, Dong Nguyen, Trong, and Sang, all of them met the Chinese leader, and most of them on a formal basis. President Aquino only had 5 to 10 minutes chit-chat when they were doing some gardening or whatever. That doesn't count for high-level dialogue. And it's awkward that the two countries that only 10 years ago had a kind of a golden age of bilateral relations are now having what I call the most toxic relationship in Asia, perhaps next to North Korea and South Korea. Perhaps even North Korea and South Korea have a better relationship than us with the Chinese. So we have to break this ice. And I don't think this means that we're abandoning the United States and the rest. We're just prioritizing. Our priority at this point is to avoid war, break the ice, and by the way, let's make sure that our relationship with China is not defined by one issue. This is an important issue, it's a red line issue, but do not allow one red line to poison the entire relationship.
Okay.
Bilateral infrastructure investments, bilateral economic relations, aside from people power, is very important. And let's be honest, if there's one country that is willing to invest huge in Mindanao, which is a high-risk area, it's not Japan, it's not the US, I think it's only China that can do that. And let's also bear in mind that China now is building nuclear power plants in the United Kingdom. That's how advanced they are in terms of their infrastructure capabilities. So we need China if we want to upgrade our economy. But I'm not saying that that means that we should fold suddenly our cards on the West Philippine Sea. So Duterte has to be very careful. When he's dealing with China, the Chinese will offer him a lot of carrots. He should stick to the game plan, which is our objective is to protect our rights. If China wants to invest in the Philippines, but don't expect us to suddenly relax our claims just because you're investing billions of dollars. Unfortunately, I think that is what the Chinese statecraft seems to be, but Duterte has to be careful not to fall for that trap. And so that is what I have in mind. And the last thing I want to say is that, you see, we are entering a post-American world. It doesn't mean we have to be enemies with US. We still need the United States on multiple key issues. And with the rise of ISIS, unfortunately in Southeast Asia, we need Americans more than ever. So I don't think Duterte is abandoning US. It's just that on this issue, he feels that the priority is to engage with China. Let's experiment. Let's see if his tactic works. If his tactic doesn't work, then we can go back to the Americans. There's always a fallback option. So this is what we call equilateral balancing.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know whether President Duterte is a good poker player, but he is really, if he should go to Beijing, he should know that he's really playing a game of poker. And the decision of the arbitration court is the ace in his hand. Now, how he will do that, of course, is something which we wish him the best. Because I believe with the others in the group that we should break the ice. Because China is a big power, it wants to save face. We are the smaller kuya and ate, whatever, and we should do that. But when we go to Beijing, I hope that our president will be accompanied by the right advisors, that they will be able to understand Chinese and know what the Chinese are talking among themselves, and not to sell the country down the river. We have an ace in our hands at last. How do we do that for the national interest?
Thank you. We still have time for questions from our media colleagues. Please raise your hand. We'll
The mic is
pass the
here in front,
microphone. Pakisuyo lang if there are questions from our friends from the media. Okay. We're not limiting the questions to our friends from ABS-CBN. I saw Maki Pulido somewhere. You may have questions, Maki. Please. We'd like to acknowledge our friends from the media who are here. We have GMA7, we also have ABS-CBN, GNN, Net25, TV5, and we have DZTT. Yes, please. The microphone is there for your question. Meron pang tanong dyan? Okay, now, my question is, people think the Philippines is the biggest winner and would benefit from the decision. Would we really? Or are we having a more, will we live in more precarious times with the ruling that the tribunal gave us? Richard.
Okay. Why should I be first? Okay.
Because you came in last.
What was the question? Will we be in a worse? Yeah. Will we be in a bad?
Are we really
Are we really the winners here? Because some people think it's the US who won with the decision.
Okay. The way I'll put it this, using the Chinese saying, this is just the first step in a journey of 1,000 miles. No, we at least clarified the legal foundations. Well, of not the sovereignty aspect, but the sovereign right and maritime entitlement place. That's one important step. But I think it would be naive for us to think that this suddenly gives us the complete upper hand or complete moral high ground. I think that's something you have to keep in mind. And as I always say, you may win in one area, but the key fight here is what's happening on the ground. And every single day, China is expanding its reclamation activities. Every single day, China is in a stronger position to impose an exclusion zone, not only in this practice, but all across the South China Sea. So how do we use this verdict? How do we use international pressure to convince the Chinese to at least give us certain concessions within our waters? This is, I hope, what the administration will do. But that's the Filipino in me. The objective side in me fears that even if Duterte and China may strike a deal that allows for the Philippines to gain concessions, what about other countries in the ASEAN? I'll be very brutal about it because there is a possibility that China will try to divide and conquer us once again. So they'll try to cut a deal with us, and then they will overcompensate by being more aggressive towards Malaysia, towards Vietnam, and other countries. That's the game they have been playing for a long time. For a long time, they were nicer to Malaysia, they were more aggressive towards Vietnam, then they became more aggressive towards us, so it now could fall on someone else. Because the fact of the matter is that when the Chinese talk about South China Sea, they're not talking about the Philippines. They're talking about a whole basin that is claimed by multiple countries. So we may get out, we may get a Chinexit in the West Philippine Sea, but the Malaysians and the Vietnamese will not get the Chinexid in their waters. And this is the problem we're facing. That is why from the American perspective, it's important that Duterte and other like-minded countries to stick to the game plan, have a unified approach, and put maximum pressure on China until it blinks. In game theory, we call it stag hunt, right? So you need multiple players to get the stag. But if suddenly one player says, I'm hungry, I'll just get the rabbit and step out, no one gets the stag. And the stag here is to change China's behavior in the South China Sea. All right, I'll just keep it there before I become more arcane. Thank you.
Okay. Aileen?
Yeah. Well, legally, you might say that we are winners now. No? But like Richard, of course, the challenge still lies ahead. No? How to turn the legal and moral victory into a political victory for us in relation to China and the region as a whole, no? As far as the maritime issues are concerned. But I think more importantly, to fully say that we have won, or we have benefited from this award, I think that requires a lot of domestic policy work. Again, going to our shared advocacy with Senator Shahani, we are an archipelagic state. The maritime environment is very critical, not only to our diplomacy and security, but to our environment, our development, food security, and so on. No? So this award, in a way, no, by at least addressing the parts of the disputed area that represent resources for us, fisheries, you know, aquatic minerals, whatever, no, aquatic life, and oil and gas resources, they can, I think our original intent was to be able to make use of these resources for the development and well-being of the Filipino people. So I think we should stick to that principal goal as far as the immediate EEZ will be concerned. The diplomacy will be very important, relations with China, the strategic concerns will be very important. But I think this will have to play, for now, a secondary role to the development dimension.
Very well. Maganda ito. So, papantayan natin kung ano magaganap. Pero, legally, we've won. The problem is how to bring it down to reality. Right? Okay? It will require diplomacy. Skills in diplomacy. Do we have that, Manang Letty? From the outside looking in?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. You see, I mean, as I said, we have diplomats who really speak Chinese, who can go there and negotiate. Not to negotiate in English, but to negotiate in the Chinese language, you see. And that takes a lot of discipline and knowledge. Now, if we cannot do that, we can begin to train people. Because we think that everyone speaks English, but in negotiations, this is very dangerous. You might be selling the country down the river and you may not know it, that you're doing it. So I think Filipinos have to eat humble pie and learn what is our, I think this is part of our national identity, Melo. We are a maritime country, but we're thinking we think we're a continent because the Americans wanted to sell us cars, you see. So the Philippine Navy was never developed. We just had patrol boats during the time of MacArthur. But they sold us Studebakers, Dodge. I know it because I was a child then, and my father was very good in explaining to his kids what was a Studebaker, a Dodge, and we bought a Dodge, although we could only pay our gasoline bill at the end of the month, you see. But this is part of the colonial mentality which we have acquired and which we should remove now. That we are a maritime people and that the sea is our element. So we should learn how to ride the boats from Batanes to Manila instead of always taking the Fariñas bus. You see? And then why don't we look for water transportation? And why do women always look for skin whiteners when if you are by the sea, you really have to be dark because it's very hot. And you know, our culture is really geared towards continental identity. This is now is the challenge. Talagang tayo ba ay anak ng dagat? You see?
That is the question.
That is the question. And we learn how to swim in swimming pools, but we never learn how to swim in the sea. We drown. You see, and I was born in Lingayen Gulf, so I know all of this drama of so on. So do we eat seaweeds? We don't. We prefer to eat a McDonald's hamburger. You see, so fish is our staple thing. So we should go back to that maritime identity when we as an Ausonesian people, we mastered the waves and we mastered the stars and we went all the way to Madagascar without any compass. This is what I'm trying to say. We have to regain that dignity, which I think we share with peoples of Japan, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Oceania, Indonesia, etc. We are a maritime people. And this is part of our national identity. Unless we do that, nangangapa tayo eh. We're always feeling inferior to the Chinese just because they belong to a continent. And this 200-mile exclusive economic zone was a Philippine-Indonesian achievement. And we had to fight for that, see? And I think we should go back to history. And this non-dash line was a invention of Chiang Kai-shek, and Mao Zedong just agreed to it. And then now they're making it the Chinese official policy. But if you read the Vietnamese scholars, I mean, they question all of that, you see. So I think there's so much work to be done, but we have to rectify the situation.
Yes. We have Chito Santa Romana. Dumating si Chito. Chito, welcome.
Sorry, no problem.
The incontinent vessels.
All right. Did I hear it right? Incoming ambassador, Chito Santa
Special envoy.
Special envoy. Chito, pakisuyo nga po nung kape na sa bisita natin. Okay. Hot water. Chito, how do you look at the recent decision by the tribunal? Pakisuyo po ng microphone natin. Pero your views, no?
As the
Okay,
incoming.
it's a very impressive legal victory. The key challenge now is to enforce it. How to make China accept this. And this, I think, is the key challenge. You could look at it this way. Perhaps, although it was a difficult and arduous legal struggle, actually it may be the easy part. The hard part comes now. Is because the Chinese, for those of you who followed the reaction last night, it was not just the foreign ministry, President Xi Jinping. So they're taking, and the way he framed it is what makes it worrisome. Of course, they don't accept the ruling, but he framed it as a defense of sovereignty, as a defense of what the Chinese call their core interest. So they're prepared. If anybody were to send troops to mischief right now, expect a military confrontation. So the problem is how to pursue this peacefully and how to resolve it peacefully. And this is going to be the challenge. I liken it a bit to China's position 1989 after Tiananmen Square, when this was the lowest point of diplomatic isolation for China. And what happened there, very similar now, is a siege mentality. The Chinese, People's Daily last night, was talking of a US, Japan, Philippines, Australia conspiracy, a Western conspiracy against China. So expect that we will go through a storm of rhetoric, hopefully just rhetoric. But I think it is quite possible, because the Chinese have framed it into a defense of sovereignty, that they will not, I don't expect that they will launch an attack on Panatan, or in the Philippines or Palawan. But they will try to hold on to what the tribunal says belongs to the Philippines, our exclusive economic zone. Mainly Mischief Reef particularly. It's a major victory because Mischief Reef now is legally is ours. Now how to make that into a reality is going to be the challenge. And so I don't envy the position of the Duterte administration because what you have here, I wish this came last year under Aquino. So, because it's the Aquino administration's brainchild. The legal strategy inherited by an administration that actually has different ideas. So it's going to be interesting to see what they come up with. But the point I'm making is that the key here is how, on the one hand, as I've mentioned in other talks, to engage the Chinese, but at the same time to have enough deterrence capability together with allies to forestall any adventurism, if there is, by the Chinese military in these coming days. And just to wind up, what you should watch carefully is how the Chinese will treat, and Jay may have touched this already. There's one thing in the tribunal that's kind of interesting in the ruling. It talks of traditional fishing rights of the Filipinos and the Chinese. So, Yasai got criticized for this, but the tribunal upheld the idea of sharing the fishery resources together with Vietnam and Taiwan, those that have traditional. I didn't know that was possible legally, but Jay can delve into that. But since it's part of the ruling is very important for clarifying for us our maritime entitlements. The Chinese don't accept it, and the problem is to convince them. And lastly, aside from the fishermen, whether the Chinese will move on reclaiming. Chances are they won't, but I could be wrong. Mainly because their main diplomatic priority is to win over the Duterte administration right now. And so you see this delicate diplomatic dance between China and the Duterte administration. The Duterte administration is pretty clear. They don't want to taunt the Chinese, they don't want to flaunt the ruling, but how will they use this to advantage? How they will use it as a leverage, or how they will use it, because it's a major victory, and how they will use it to improve, to pursue Philippine national interests. Beyond the bilateral issue, I think the key now is really the strategic issue, US and China. And it's possible you may have some incidents because the Chinese may challenge more of the reconnaissance flights of the US, and so you could have a repeat of the 2001 incident over Hainan. Hopefully it won't happen. So possibly the US patrols have now moved back a little to 14 miles to 20 miles. If they were to go into the 20 miles, 12 miles right now, it's possible the Chinese would react. So you may have some incidents and possibly a limited crisis, but hopefully not into an outbreak of military conflict.
Historically, meron bang armed conflict na pinapapilan o pinasukan ang mga China?
India, Vietnam, Korea. So the Chinese have used force when they're under certain circumstances, but it tends to be limited. They don't stay. Like in the case of India, they withdrew. In the case of Vietnam, they withdrew. In the case of Korea, after the stalemate, they withdrew. But the point here is there is a paradox in dealing with China, in negotiating with China, and this is based on their negotiating history. And the two cases I want to cite are the recent ones, Vietnam and the Soviet Union or Russia. In the case of Vietnam, it took 30 years, including border war. And then only after another 10 years of estrangement did they finally decide, the Vietnamese decided to normalize relations, and then they achieved their agreement in another 10 years. So 30 years, including clashes. In the case of the Soviet Union, under Brezhnev and Mao, nobody wanted to yield. Mao said, do not yield an inch of sovereignty in the border clash. So they had border clashes. And that gave the opening to the US to Nixon visit and all of that. But the point is, it took another 10 years until Gorbachev came to power and the Soviet Union collapsed, and then Yeltsin came to power, and then you have another 10 years, actually 15 to 20 years. They finally divided 50-50. The Usuri River. So the paradox here is this: the harder you are with China, the harder the response is. If you become softer in the sense that you improve political relations, it's easier for them to be accommodated. Why it is not succeeded in the Philippine case is another discussion, but this is the paradox. And also the change of leadership sometimes provides an opportunity. And so in the case of Vietnam, it was the change of leadership in Vietnam and the Chinese. In the case of Russia, it was the change of leadership from Brezhnev to Gorbachev to Yeltsin. And now we have a change of leadership. So it may, it's no guarantees in this.
So you're talking of leadership, not dealership. There's another difference, right? Yes.
Yeah. Again, thank you very much, Chito, for also delving into the domestic politics of China. The thing I have is that during the Cold War, when we talk about Mao, he was a paramount leader and he had a lot of command over the whole state apparatus. The biggest problem we have in the South China Sea today, and a lot of scholars have looked into it, is that we sometimes are not sure who's really calling the shot in the South China Sea. One of our problems is that the Hainan government, for instance, in China, has been assembling so-called militia come fishermen. Fishermen who are actually armed, fishermen who actually have GPS, fishermen who actually get fuel subsidy from their government to push the boundaries of their claims across the area. We know that the South Sea Fleet of China, their PLA South Sea Fleet, has also been extremely influential in the last 10 years. And they're claiming more and more waters. They really believe that the South China Sea is their natural harbor. It's an area where they have to have some sort of a strategic depth. That's what they call it. So the question, so you have many different interest groups who want China to keep on pushing the boundaries of China's strategic presence in the South China Sea. So the question we are facing here today is Xi Jinping strong enough to rein in these different elements? And is Xi Jinping comfortable enough to risk domestic backlash if he's seen as compromising with the Philippines because of the verdict that came out that they themselves have said that is null and void? So there's also the domestic politics in China that we have to take into consideration. And the thing is this, in democratic country, Duterte can say, you voted for me, so I have a mandate. In China, Xi Jinping did not win based on electoral mandate. He has to constantly prove to the people that he deserves to be a leader. So sometimes, ironically, autocratic leaders tend to be even more sensitive to public opinion than democratic leaders who actually have democratic mandate during the elections time.
Yeah.
So that's the other aspect that we have to talk about. I'm glad that Chito is bringing the Chinese domestic politics into this aspect. And that is why I think the statement of Yasai, I'm not justifying his beating statement, but I think Yasai had in mind what will be the Chinese public reaction. Because if he flaunted and taunted it, how will this be used by hardliners in China to put pressure on Xi Jinping to teach a lesson, quote unquote, to the Philippines and these conspirators like Japan and US? This is the unfortunate aspect of when foreign policy becomes domesticated. When you have popular nationalism dictating how leaders act, whether democratically elected or autocratically in positions of power. So I think this is the unfortunate aspect that we also have to keep in consideration, and do not look at China as if there's a clear leader and it's monolithic. There's a lot of domestic politics that is also happening there that we have to also keep in mind.
Okay. Jane, in as much as we're winding up, please show the audience your scoreboard and explain to us what it is all about.
Yes, we prepared this, the Institute, for easier, quick understanding of the ruling. This is a score sheet.
Hold on to it.
We have separated all of the many different claims and issues and ticked off whether they were granted or denied. And you can really see in very simple terms, whether it was in our favor or not. And then there is also a reference to the specific paragraph of the decision of the tribunal where you can find the reasoning. So this is really like a crib sheet, an outline and a guide for you. And there are also excerpts of the pertinent portions, the most important portions of the ruling. And this was done by our staff. si Attorney Bert nandyan, saka yung aming mga RAs. So we hope that it will be helpful for you, no? Especially as you report on this really long decision. No? 479 pages, try reading that overnight. No? And also we've collected some of the summaries of the cases as well as the statements as of this morning tungkol sa arbitration. So we hope that helps everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Professor Baviera, closing statements na tayo. What would you have to say? Hindi, si Manang Letty, si Chito.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think we now have some. I hate to call it ammunition because it sounds so combative, but we do have something in our favor. We do have some cards now that will allow us to play, hopefully, a better, more effective diplomatic game aside from the legal considerations.
Okay. Manang Letty, message to our listeners, to the Filipino people.
Well, I hope that, I'm glad that Melo continues to be interested in the West Philippine Sea because I think public knowledge of our maritime nature as a country is so important for our national identity and for our sense of nationalism and sense of nationhood. And I really hope that the present administration will be able to appreciate the gains which this the decision of the tribunal has given us, and that, as I said, if President Duterte goes to Beijing and he has to play poker, I hope that he will know how to play the game properly. And if he has national interest in his heart, I'm sure that he will do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chito. Message to everyone about this ruling, and then we'll post for our pictures. Yes.
Mahaba na yung sinabi ko eh. Pero I want to pick up on the Chinese domestic politics. The problem we have right now is that Xi Jinping is faced with a party congress next year. So he's faced with a situation where he cannot appear weak. And so I expect he will take a hard position. Not only because of his own survival, it has something to do with the Communist Party survival. And if you watch the Chinese propaganda, a lot of it sounds so absurd for foreigners or for Filipinos and others. But it's directed at the domestic audience. They have to persuade their own people why they did not participate, why the Chinese position is correct, and why they say the arbitral tribunal is unfair. And they threw in everything, including the kitchen sink. That the one who appointed the judges was a Japanese, and that there are 4 of the 5 are European. So the race factor, the ethnic factor, they threw in everything. But the point I'm making is that why they have to persuade their domestic audience. It's interesting in a survey conducted by an Australian scholar and Chinese scholars, and this goes back to 2013, after we filed our arbitration. They were told to pick the preference in terms of the South China Sea. Arbitration, sending in the troops, or negotiation and compromise, or the government policy of shelving the dispute and joint development. Arbitration was high. Sending in the troops and compromise was high. Sending in the troops and the current policy of shelving dispute and joint development was low. So you can see the popular support for the government policy is quite low. But they have to persuade their domestic audience. What this shows, though, is that it is, you see, the Communist Party of China, their legitimacy is at stake here. And so expect the siege mentality for a while. And it may be a long while.
Really? Okay. Medyo mabigat yun. Sky, papaalam tayo. I'd like to thank our friends, sina Annie, Wong, at ganun din. Kasama rin natin, siyempre, si Harvey from Lido. Thank you very much. Next week, we will talk about fishing and food. Ano implikasyon nito sa pangingisda? So we'd like to invite guys from the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries, and Aquatic Resources, and everything na may kinalaman sa pagkain. Dito yan sa atin sa Wednesday Roundtable at Lido. So, thank you very much. Have a nice time. We look forward to more fruitful discussions. Salamat po. Magandang araw.